In any big city in Canada, you can walk into a store, browse an ample selection of magic mushrooms, and buy whatever you want. So you could be forgiven for thinking that magic mushrooms have been legalized in Canada, or that there has been some kind of change to their legal status. And indeed, there has been a change in how magic mushrooms are seen in our society. Survey data suggests that 2 million Canadians used psychedelics last year, many of them purchasing magic mushrooms from a local dispensary. And there is serious ongoing research into magic mushrooms as treatment for PTSD, for depression, addiction, and many of these medical trials are taking place here in Canada. So our society's views and understanding of magic mushrooms really have been changing. But all this raises an important question. Has the criminal law kept pace with changes in how our society views magic mushrooms? My name is George Gray. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Toronto. On this channel, I explore topics in criminal law that matter to all Canadians and that all Canadians should understand. Today, we're going to talk about magic mushrooms. We're going to talk about their legal status in Canada and about how much trouble you'd realistically be in if you were caught with magic mushrooms. I'm also going to explain how you might be committing the criminal offense of trafficking magic mushrooms without even knowing it. We're going to talk about the legal status of magic mushroom dispensaries and how they stay open and what happens when they are raided by police. And finally, we're going to talk about whether legalization is realistically going to happen for magic mushrooms in Canada. Now, before we go any further, I need to mention that none of what I'm going to talk about today is legal advice. This video is for educational and entertainment purposes. If you need legal advice, you should speak with a lawyer. If you'd like, you can reach out to my firm directly via the contact information below. So, the first thing that you need to know is that magic mushrooms do remain illegal to possess in Canada. Psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, is listed in Schedule 3 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. So it is illegal to possess. Kind of. Back in 2020, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada, Canada's drug prosecutors, said we're really just focused on the trafficking side of things. So mostly we're not going to prosecute personal possession of drugs, not just magic mushrooms, any drugs. So while psilocybin remains illegal on the books, possessing a small amount for your own use is generally not prosecuted. And that doesn't quite mean you'll never be charged because the police are not subject to this policy, but even that is quite rare. Now, there are some important exceptions to this policy, and I'm not going to be able to get into all of them in this video. But the biggest caveat that needs to be mentioned is for trafficking. And many people might think, I'm not a drug dealer, I'm not selling drugs, so how could I be guilty of trafficking? But the definition of trafficking is broader than you might think. The Controlled Drugs and Substances Act defines trafficking to include, yes, selling, but also administering and also giving drugs. So if you were to share some magic mushrooms with a friend, that would technically constitute trafficking a controlled substance, which does remain a prosecuted offense in Canada. However, charges in a situation like that would be very unlikely because of the quantity of drugs involved. Most cases where an intention to traffic magic mushrooms is proven in court involve kilograms of magic mushrooms. The lowest amount I have seen in the case law was about 500 grams or half a kilo. Even with that amount of magic mushrooms, it would be tough to argue that it was all for your own use. I also want to mention that purchasing illegal drugs does not make you guilty of trafficking. Parliament has specifically excluded purchasers from the offense. So purchasing a small amount of psilocybin would only make a personal possession, which would normally fall under the non-prosecution policy that I just mentioned. Now, in reality, there have been very few reported cases of convictions for trafficking only in magic mushrooms. However, all that changed in 2024. In 2023 and in 2024, shroom dispensaries started opening up across Canada. Police sometimes turned a blind eye to these stores. Canadian cities are struggling with drug addiction issues involving far more harmful substances than magic mushrooms. So some police services, including the Toronto Police Service, have indicated that enforcing laws against magic mushroom trafficking is a lower priority. But despite having other priorities, magic mushroom dispensaries are raided by police from time to time, and criminal charges are now frequently laid. When these cases end up in court, there is a division in the case law. On one hand, we see decisions where sentencing judges are highly sympathetic to dispensary workers. Typically, it's the low-level employees that are caught. They're making minimum wage, selling a drug that causes little societal harm, at least in comparison to other drugs. And sometimes these workers don't even seem to know the stores they are working in are illegal. So let's look at some examples. In the 2024 case of the King versus Vagonos, the accused was working behind the counter at a dispensary called the Mushroom Cabinet in Hamilton. He sold magic mushrooms to an undercover officer, and the next day he was arrested when the store was raided by police. He pleaded guilty to possession of psilocybin for the purpose of trafficking. The sentencing judge gave Mr. Vaganos a conditional discharge. A conditional discharge is a way of finding a person guilty without sending them to jail and without giving them a permanent criminal record. It's one of the lightest sanctions available in criminal law. The judge in that case zeroed in on the lack of harm caused by magic mushrooms, especially in comparison to other drugs. He wrote, "Psilocybin is not to blame for what afflicts Hamilton's urban core. Housing instability, mental unwellness, property crime, and violent tendencies cannot be tied to the consumption of psilocybin." Like for Mr. Vaganos, most store clerks arrested working in dispensaries have received the same sentence, a conditional discharge with probation. However, some judges have given harsher sentences and seem to be exasperated by the open nature of these dispensaries. The law is what it is, and courts can't sanction such brazen rule breaking. For example, in the 2024 case of the King versus Osoris, the accused was a store clerk working at a dispensary called Shrooms located in Queen West in Toronto. He was sentenced to possession of 17 kilograms of magic mushrooms. The sentencing judge focused on the open nature of how this dispensary operated. He wrote, "Mr. Osoris was involved in illegal commercial activity. Law-abiding citizens who see this type of store operating in public so brazenly must wonder how it can be allowed to continue and why those involved appear to escape accountability. I find this business's open and notorious features to be extraordinarily aggravating." In this case, the judge sentenced Mr. Osoris to 60 days of house arrest, leaving him with a permanent criminal record. We see similar sentences to this and longer in cases of more senior employees like store managers. But the only reported cases where people have been sent to jail for trafficking magic mushrooms were cases that involved significantly worse circumstances, either other drugs or evidence of trafficking mushrooms to minors. This is, of course, always subject to change, and jail is certainly an available sentence for trafficking psilocybin. So now you know that despite scant enforcement of rules against possessing magic mushrooms, there can be serious criminal sanctions for trafficking them. If this scenario feels familiar, it should be. This is more or less the way things were in Canada for marijuana in the early 2010s. As you may remember, after a long series of court challenges and different attempts to regulate cannabis, recreational use of cannabis was finally legalized in 2018. So are we headed in that same direction for magic mushrooms? Like cannabis, psilocybin is not without risks, but those risks are relatively low, especially compared to other substances like alcohol or prescription opiates that are both legal to consume. And it is increasingly now accepted that psilocybin can be an effective way of treating certain health conditions. It's also now possible to obtain a Health Canada exemption to allow patients to legally obtain medical psilocybin for treatment of things like depression. However, the treatment regime is very supervised and difficult to access. Even if you're able to find a doctor to apply on your behalf, the majority of these applications are denied. This is something to keep an eye on because with cannabis legalization, the rights of patients to reasonable access to cannabis as a means of medical treatment was an important trigger for eventual full legalization. As we get more and more evidence for the medical benefits of psilocybin, there will be increasing pressure on the government from the courts to make it easier for people to get legal access to mushrooms as a form of treatment. Outside of medical benefits, people on magic mushrooms often report having spiritual or mystical experiences that have a highly positive impact on their lives. This was more or less the basis for a recent court challenge to laws prohibiting psilocybin in the 2025 case of the King versus the Aquila. Samar Aquila, the owner of a fungi's dispensary in London, Ontario, was the accused. His store had been raided by police and he was charged with trafficking magic mushrooms. His lawyers argued that access to psilocybin is critical to allow a person to experience the full freedom of thought that is protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. However, the judge in that case disagreed and wrote that the experience of taking a psychedelic drug is not what the freedom of thought was meant to protect. For that judge, the experience of a mushrooms trip is too unpredictable to be a protected form of thought. But there are other cases currently before the courts challenging restrictions on accessing magic mushrooms, and you can bet there will be many more coming. I asked at the beginning of this video if criminal law has kept pace with changes in how our society views magic mushrooms. In some ways it has. Prosecutions for possession of drugs for personal use are now much less common than they used to be. And like we saw with cannabis dispensaries, police seem to treat magic mushroom dispensaries as a low priority target, meaning that many such dispensaries are able to stay open. However, the law hasn't actually changed. Psilocybin remains a controlled substance in Canada, and when cases do reach the courts, judges are forced to wrestle with what that means in a society whose views seem to be changing. My personal view is that if medical studies continue to show that psilocybin is capable of treating conditions that other drugs cannot, the government will have to provide legal and easy access to medical psilocybin in the near future, probably the next 3 to 5 years. Whether that takes a form of full legalization like it did with cannabis or a more limited scheme remains to be seen. Regardless of legalization, one place that you don't want to be with magic mushrooms or cannabis or any other drug is the border. Some of the harshest sentences in Canadian criminal law are reserved for offenses involving international crossings. And even for travelers carrying nothing illegal, a border search can raise questions about your privacy and rights. In my next video, I'll walk you through what really happens when you cross an international border and how you can do it without putting yourself in legal jeopardy. If you or someone you know is facing a drug charge or any criminal charge, please feel free to reach out to me directly via the contact information below. For everyone else, if you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe for more insights into how Canadian criminal law works in real life. Thank you for watching.